Sonic is probably the series that I have the most history with in all of gaming, right next to The Legend of Zelda. I've been following the series closely since I was really young, right around the time that Sonic Generations was the newest game. I went through as much of the series history as I could, especially loving the Adventure and Boost era games, and eventually gaining a massive appreciation for the classic 16-bit titles as well. This is the first time that I brought up the series on the channel, but I could go on for ages about all the individual games and how much the series as a whole means to me. Someday I hope to give all of these games the proper look that they deserve, but for now I think I found a good spot to jump in. Just know that I truly love this series through all its numerous ups and downs. And I will always love this series, but these last few years it was admittedly pretty tough for me to be enthusiastic about upcoming releases. Like a lot of people, I got really swept up in the hype for Sonic Forces, so when that finally released and thoroughly underwhelmed me, it was an uphill struggle to get my trust back. The radio silence for years certainly didn't help things at all, but when the next mainline game, Sonic Frontiers, was eventually revealed, I was really skeptical. I was pleasantly surprised when the game released to a lot of positivity within the community though, so I ended up giving it a try a few months later, and yeah, I did not care for this one at all. I actually went back to Frontiers for a little bit to prepare for this video, and part of me was kind of hoping that I'd see some new light in it, but unfortunately this was a very quick reminder of why the game left such a bad taste in my mouth the first time, and to be honest, it was actually quite a bit worse than I had remembered. This isn't the place to talk about all my issues with Frontiers, but I don't really need to get into it either, because even though I didn't like it, I could always appreciate that Frontiers was a very important game for the series. There were big shifts here which felt genuinely refreshing after all of the 2010s games. The tone was more serious again, characters openly referenced past adventures, the characterization was the best that we'd seen in years, and most memorably, they weren't afraid to bring it when it came to the spectacle. The boss fights in Frontiers were truly awesome. Even if they were just as janky as the rest of the game, it felt impossible to not get swept up in the moment. Seeing Supersonic fly around fighting these giant robots to the tune of absolutely killer metal songs was really something to behold. It was the first time in a while that I was legitimately excited about something in a Sonic game again. So there was potential in there, and I liked aspects of the general direction of the series, but as a video game that I had to sit down and play, the final product did not come together for me at all, and I came away pretty pessimistic that the current Sonic team even had the ability to make a game that I found enjoyable at all. My distrust towards Sonic Team by that point was only strengthened by the fact that by this point, it had been ages since they released a game that I had actually liked. Even as a kid, I didn't really care for Lost World, I already mentioned Forces, and now Frontiers was a flop in my eyes too. The next year, Sonic Superstars released, and I was once again totally unimpressed by the pre-release material and wrote off the game entirely before it even released. When the game came out, I was not at all surprised to see the mediocre reception, and it only strengthened my view that I wasn't going to care for anything coming from Sonic Team anymore. Next came the first round of trailers for Sonic X Shadow Generations, and I was once again totally unimpressed and pessimistic. The game looked to be a remaster of Sonic Generations, which is a game that I already liked a lot, bundled with an entirely new game focused on Shadow's history to tie in with his upcoming appearance in the third movie. I once again wrote it off without giving it a chance, not only because I was so let down by the other new releases, but because the last few Sonic remasters, those being Colors Ultimate and Sonic Origins, were incredibly disappointing and inferior versions of those respective games for a number of reasons. I didn't have high hopes for a Generations remaster being any better, and I certainly didn't have any high hopes for new content. However, the months went on, we started seeing more and more trailers, we got this phenomenal animated short series called Dark Beginnings that led up to the events of the game, and something really strange started to happen. I started getting really excited. As much as I had felt burnt by this series in the last decade, I couldn't deny that I was really liking what I was seeing from these trailers. The level design looked to be a massive improvement from the last few titles, and was looking much more polished than those games too. We were seeing what looked to be a genuine celebration of Shadow's history in the series, along with the improvements in tone that came with Frontiers. I had my reservations for sure, but this was the first time in a long time that I was genuinely optimistic for a new Sonic title. And that brings us here. Shadow Generations is finally out, everyone is loving it, I've played a ton of it, and I have a lot of thoughts. And it really does bring me a lot of joy to say that, above all else, I'm happy with this game. It's not perfect, I mean, what Sonic game is, but playing this truly felt like the first genuine win for the series since Sonic Mania in 2017. And if you only want to count the games actually developed by Sonic Team, then that's going as far back as the original Sonic Generations in 2011. And speaking of the original Generations, I do actually want to take a bit of time to talk about the remaster that was included as one half of this package. I didn't really have any expectations for this other than it would be nice to have the game on PS5 as long as they didn't screw it up somehow. And I can happily confirm that not only did they not screw this up, but this remaster actually surprised me with how much better than the original it feels. For a few years now, I've been pretty used to playing the game through backwards compatibility on an Xbox Series S, and I was pretty happy with this for a while, but now that I've played this remaster, I don't think I'm ever going back to that original version. The first notable upgrade here is that, at least on current generation consoles, the entire game runs in native 4K, and it looks fantastic. Even 13 years after its original release, Generations is still a phenomenal looking game, and it shines more than ever here with barely any changes. It just goes to show the power of strong animations and art direction. But the thing that really surprised me is just how much better this version feels. And I can't even pinpoint why. This version is 60 frames per second, but so was the backwards compatible Xbox release, and somehow this just still feels snappier and more responsive. Maybe the original had input lag, maybe it's better optimized here, I'm really not sure, but I can say that I went back to the original just before this remaster was released, and I felt an immediate difference here. And just because of that alone, I can already say that this is easily my favorite version of the game. I truly had such a blast revisiting this, and it was such a fun reminder of how well the original Generations has held up from a gameplay standpoint. This really is one of the best feeling platformers I've ever played, and the levels are mostly spectacular as well. There are a few sticking points that I have mixed feelings about though. First and most inconsequentially is the new control scheme. Essentially, they reworked the button mapping so that boost is now on R2 and homing attack is now on square, so that it would be more in line with Frontiers. You can turn the controls back to how they were in the original thankfully, and that's what I've seen most people online do, but I was actually pretty excited to try them out. For all the gripes that I had with Frontiers, the new control scheme was never one of them. Boost on R2 makes a lot of sense to me, and I've always preferred homing attack on square ever since Unleashed. Unfortunately, I realized very quickly that these new controls suffer from extremely poor implementation. Their button remappings and absolutely nothing more, so they carry across the entire game. This means that while boost is now on R2, so is classic Sonic's spin dash because that was also originally mapped to the square button, and that just immediately felt terrible to use. And by the time that I got to play the modern Sonic stages, I quickly realized that while it does encourage you to use square for the homing attack, it functions identically to the original game, meaning that you just have to press the jump button again, and square is now a second jump button, which feels incredibly awkward. I'm really glad that there is still an option for legacy controls because as soon as I switched back to those, it immediately felt significantly better. Oh, and on a very minor note, the drop dash from Mania was also added to this game and it feels fine with classic Sonic, but with modern Sonic it feels incredibly awkward and laughably useless. I truly have no idea why they keep trying to make this ability work outside of a 2D context, and once again I wish that you could turn this off. Although, to be fair, it is pretty easy to ignore this since there's never a reason to use it anyway. Something that's not so easy to ignore though is the fact that the entire game has been rewritten. I was actually pretty interested in this at first because I've never cared for the writing of the original. It's no secret that Generations released in one of the worst eras when it came to writing and tone throughout the Sonic series. It's a game that's simultaneously trying to celebrate the past while being embarrassed by it, and the few interactions that the game does have come off incredibly awkward because of that. But the rewrite here can't change any of those fundamental issues with Generations' story, so it ends up feeling unnecessary more than anything. Some of the changes are nice, like how characters aren't afraid to acknowledge that they actually remember the past.
This chemical plant feels familiar. I'd never forget a smell like this. And that pink water makes me really nervous for some reason. This is definitely the chemical plant, but we're not remotely on West Side Island. Did that monster do this?
But sometimes they go overboard with the references and it feels super awkward as a result.
We're traveling through time and space!
How did this happen?
We're traveling through time, Sonic!
Without the time stones?
And sometimes the rewrites just don't make any sense because the original animations are still kept completely intact.
Thanks, Sonic. You did a good job back there. Hey, did you gain weight?
Thanks, Sonic. Now then, tell me, where is the rest of my island?
And now that I've realized how minor all of these changes really are, I can't say I'm really upset by this, especially because story was never the strong point of this game in the first place. But the fact that they rewrote all of this dialogue anyway with no option to restore the original just rubs me the wrong way, especially because otherwise this remaster is so faithful to the original. It just reminds me of those special edition Star Wars changes, and it's not something that I can really get behind. I would have preferred if they had just left the cutscenes as they were. Still, the cutscenes are such a small part of the Generations experience that I can't bring myself to be too upset by any of this, and the gameplay, the most important part, has held up so incredibly well that I found myself exceptionally pleased with this remaster, and I truly loved revisiting this game. But, as we all know, the Generations remaster is not the main event of this package. Shadow Generations is the real reason that we were all looking forward to this game so much. So, how did it turn out? Well, the first thing that I want to mention is the presentation, and this is probably going to be my most contentious point in this entire video, but this package felt disappointingly mixed to me in that regard. Immediately upon booting the game, you get smacked by this incredibly lame title screen. Just the key art for the game with no animation playing alongside a compressed theme. It's not a good look. And I'm fully aware that this is a nitpick in the grand scheme of things, but it was the very first impression I had of this game and it was not a positive one. If you really want me to get nitpicky, the cut to the credits is pretty abrupt and awkward too, but obviously not a very big deal in the grand scheme of things. Anyways, once you get past the original title screen, things do start to look a bit better. I could do without the giant ad constantly in the middle of the game select screen though. But things get a lot better once you load into the actual game and see the cutscenes, which look shockingly great. And I'll actually say right now that the animation in cutscenes is some of the best we've ever seen from this series, which is a huge pleasant surprise for me coming off of how aggressively ugly the cutscenes in Frontiers were. This is the first time that we've seen humans in the series since Unleashed 2, and I really love how they look here. Maria especially, this is the first time that she hasn't looked unintentionally creepy, and that really helps sell some later scenes that I'll talk about in a bit. Well, everything I just said is true, but the moment they accidentally stretch one of these cutscenes, which happens a couple times, I stop thinking about all of that because this just looks so distractingly terrible. They did this in Frontiers too, and I cannot believe that mistakes like this keep making it into the final products. It looks so awful whenever this happens, and it takes me out of the experience completely. And it's really not a good sign when one of those scenes just happens to be immediately after you finish the final boss. Still though, generally speaking, things in cutscenes are looking pretty great. I only start taking issues once you get to the levels themselves. Look, this is clearly not ideal. The visuals look fine enough in a vacuum, and even if you just compare this to Forces or Frontiers, this is night and day in terms of visual quality. But start comparing this to games from over a decade ago, like Unleashed or even the original Generations, which, let me remind you, is quite literally bundled with this game. It's not even close. The art direction and animations pale in comparison to what we had 13 years ago. The colors are so much drier than they have any need to be, and the art direction overall just isn't nearly as good in my opinion. And the difference in quality is only exemplified because this is a Generations game, meaning that I have multiple other images in my head that I'm constantly drawing comparisons to. This has never been an issue for me with the original game. I think every level there is an easy visual upgrade. But even from before the game released, I was counting issues with this one. There were official trailers comparing the new levels to their original counterparts, specifically one that compared Space Colony Arc to the level in Sonic Adventure 2, and the original just simply looks better to me because of the art direction and colors. And the in-game animations are a sticking point for me too because we're still dealing with leftovers from Forces, and that's why everything feels so toned down compared to the first few Boost games. I'm somewhat optimistic that this won't be an issue for the next Sonic game, because this was a smaller scale project that reused a lot of assets and released at a lower price point. And it's not like this is something that's actively bothering me when I'm playing the game. I'm just so tired of this series not being able to match the visual standard that it set for itself 15 years ago with Unleashed. And I finally got a taste of that again with the cutscenes, which are on the same level as that game's. It's just that in-game, we are still nowhere close, and that is disappointing. Aside from the visuals though, the soundtrack is actually largely better than I had expected based on the previews. I still don't think this holds a candle to previous games, though this is admittedly mostly just personal preference. The soundtrack leans really heavily into electronic sounds, and it's definitely not my favorite direction for this series, but as remixes of older tracks, I feel like most of these work pretty well. The only song in the game I straight up dislike is Chaos Island Act 1, which sounds so ridiculous that I still laugh every single time that I play this level. And I do wish that the white space theme was a bit more memorable, especially since you spent so much time in this area. It feels pretty generic as is. But most of the remixes here I actually enjoyed. Sunset Heights Act 1 is probably one of my favorites. It's really energetic and exciting, and basically gives me all the feelings that I wished Forces did back when I first played it. And my favorite theme in the game is probably the redone version of Supporting Me, which has this insane guitar solo added into the second phase. Overall, I think that this soundtrack is pretty solid. This series' musical legacy is far too strong for me to feel comfortable saying anything more than that, but you really can't go wrong with a Sonic soundtrack. Still though, for this kind of game, presentation is ultimately not the biggest deal in the world. One thing that I know a lot of Sonic fans were really looking forward to though is the story, and I'm glad to say that, at least for me, this lived up to expectations. We could all tell from the marketing that this story was going to be very different in tone from the original generations. Where that game was largely afraid to be anything other than goofy and lighthearted, Shadow Generations leans heavily into the sides of the series that game seemed so desperate to brush over. We see this pretty much immediately. The opening cutscene seems to poke fun at how different these two games are. There's a flash down to Sonic's birthday party while Shadow is up brooding in the Space Colony Ark, refusing to leave until he stops a potential threat. Eventually, we see that the threat that Shadow was sensing earlier is none other than Black Doom, who starts throwing Shadow around locations from his past. Soon enough, the Time Eater attacks just as he did in the original generations, and Shadow is thrown into his own version of the timeless void that is white space. Here he is forced to revisit his past, but unlike Sonic's adventure, which was a fun trip down memory lane, Shadow's past holds a lot more pain for him, and it's something he's been running away from for decades now. For example, it's not long at all before he's reminded of Gerald and Maria, the closest thing he ever had to family, but he quickly dismisses them as an illusion. After a few levels though, he sees Gerald and Maria again, and he's forced to save them and come face to face with them again. This makes him realize that they're here because they come from a point in time from before the incident on the Ark that cost them their lives, and he wonders if he can do anything to save them. And I'll say right now, Shadow's interactions between these two are by far my favorite part of this story. It's not completely perfect, specifically when it comes to Gerald, if you ask me. I think that this game treats him with a bit too much sympathy. It tries to paint this picture of a pure man that was eventually corrupted by the tragedies on the Ark, but I find that incredibly hard to buy. Adventure 2 painted the image of someone who was deeply, fundamentally disturbed. This is the man that held Maria on the Ark against her immediate family's wishes in an extremely dangerous environment with tons of artificial chaos and eventually the Bio-Lizard, and the same man that tried to go on a genocidal rampage against all of humanity as a form of revenge before he was executed. If Gerald really was as innocent and pure as he's portrayed here in this game, then none of that makes any sense to me, even after the tragedies on the Ark. I could see this critique potentially being waved away by saying that this is just how Shadow viewed him, and because he never understood the issues with Gerald, we don't see those issues from his perspective. But we're very much under the impression that this is the real Gerald and the real Maria from the real Space Colony Ark, just before the incidents that kicked off Adventure 2. So I can't really buy that. Thankfully though, the real focus here is not on Gerald, it's on Maria because she was always more important to Shadow. And thankfully, I find her portrayal here to be practically perfect. Her interactions with Shadow are so sweet, so sincere, and they bring out a side of this hedgehog that we haven't seen since the flashback scenes in Adventure 2. My favorite scene in this game is the one where Maria explains to Shadow why she named him, because not only does it give us greater insight into the origins of both of these characters, but it's so nice to see something genuinely reach Shadow, who so often puts up this cold emotional barrier to everything around him. We see him genuinely smile in this game, and it's fantastic. Maria was the only character that would have been able to do this to Shadow, and this is the only way that we would have been able to see her again. So I think that the direction that they took both of these characters in was perfect for another Generations game. Throughout the game, Shadow keeps picking up these Doom powers, and it's eventually revealed that by essentially feeding Shadow more of his DNA, Black Doom is trying to corrupt him and force him to join his forces. But Shadow is able to resist thanks to his conversations with Maria. He's able to fully embrace these Doom powers, but also shows that he's completely in control of himself, which I think is the perfect direction for a character that's always been about carving his own path regardless of what anybody else wants for him. Alongside all of this though, there's this one moment where it feels like the writers suddenly remembered that Shadow did actually appear in the original Generations, and so out of nowhere there's this random cutscene of Shadow suddenly appearing in Sonic's version of White Space and having their rival battle. And this was always incredibly weird to me for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's not clear how Shadow ended up in this section of White Space at all. Literally every other point in the game he's confined to this one area that this is not a part of. And secondly, it's just a cutscene. There's no playable boss fight like there was in the original Generations, which is a really strange missed opportunity. It also reuses Sonic's model from Frontiers, which is so distracting because this model just looks terrible compared to Shadow's, and even compared to Sonic's look in the original Generations, and I feel like a broken record at this point, but again, let me remind you, it was bundled with this game. I can't help but compare the two. And all of these things just add up to make this moment not nearly as cool as it clearly wants to be, which is pretty disappointing as I was really interested in seeing how the two stories would collide. It's not like it's the biggest deal in the world, it is just a short cutscene after all, but it did take me out of the experience a lot on each of my playthroughs. I'll admit though, I do really like the touch of him swapping out the Chaos Emerald with Tails' fake one. That was a great moment. Back to the main plot, after Shadow eventually defeats Black Doom, he considers using Chaos Control to keep all of them frozen in the same place and time so that they continue to be together. But Maria ends up stopping him, saying that she and Gerald both need to continue moving forward with their lives, not being stuck in the same place. Even knowing what's going to happen to both of them, Shadow decides to respect their decision and rushes off to support Sonic in his final battle with the Time Eater, silently shedding a tear on the way there. It's a surprisingly bittersweet ending, but I do really like this moment, and it feels fitting for Shadow to continue moving on despite how much pain his past continues to cause him. Now he's finally gotten closure, he got a final goodbye with Maria, and he got to save them, even if it wasn't how he wanted to. The story as a whole, I ended up being pretty happy with. Plot-wise, there's really not that much going on, kinda similar to the original Generations in that sense, but the characterization is way stronger than that game, and there's a consistent arc present throughout the entire game. I'm thrilled that the tone is back to taking itself seriously, it's not afraid to be a bit more edgy like much of the series output in the 2000s, but most importantly, it's completely sincere. Having Shadow finally reconcile with his past was truly the perfect way to utilize another shot at a Generations story, and I'm really glad that this story turned out the way that it did. So I'm glad that the story lived up to my expectations, but what really mattered to me with this game was the gameplay. Even if a Sonic game has a rough story, I can still find plenty of joy replaying it if the gameplay is good enough, and that's why I find Generations to be such a great time regardless of its lackluster writing. The gameplay though, I'm happy to say, is also pretty solid. The biggest thing that I was personally worried about coming off of both Forces and Frontiers was the controls, and, well, it's an interesting case because they're almost exactly what I was worried that they would be, which is to say that it feels like Forces again, although admittedly there is a ton of extra polish here. I know that saying that might sound kind of shocking, so let me explain myself. I don't mean this as an insult, and these controls are way better than Forces. I just mean to say, this game builds off of the foundation that Forces established. There's still a few significant differences, but they mainly come down to polish. For example, Forces had an incredibly awkward sense of acceleration, where Shadow's here is a lot more natural. What I mainly mean when I say that this is built off of Forces is the top speed the characters can realistically reach, the double jump, and the way that turning works. However, I have to say that the controls here bother me much less than they did in either of those games. I don't think it's perfect, and I still vastly prefer the Unleashed in Generations style controls, but I will say that this game made me legitimately consider the benefits of this new control scheme in a way that I never had reason to before. The main advantage that this has over the previous one is that it is now significantly easier to control yourself at slower speeds. In Unleashed in Generations, Sonic's controls were most easily comparable to a race car, because that made sense for the high-octane level design, but on the occasions where you had to slow down, it definitely took some getting used to, and it didn't feel super natural or intuitive. Here, slower speeds are immediately easy to handle. The area where this makes an especially huge difference is the more open hub area, but it's also useful for more precise platforming in the levels themselves. The downside then is that the sense of speed is dramatically reduced from what we saw in Unleashed and even Generations. Look at the fastest moments of each game side by side, and it's not a flattering comparison. I also feel like there's less fluidity. Actions don't play into each other as much as they used to. There's no momentum behind the homing attack, for example. Sonic used to bounce off enemies differently depending on angle or speed going into it, but here Shadow just teleports directly above them in the exact same way every time. This control scheme feels a lot more stop and go in general. I've seen a shocking amount of people use this race car analogy as evidence that this control scheme has aged poorly in the wake of this package releasing. But I have to question why people think this is an issue in the first place when the levels are very clearly designed around it. You wouldn't put a Sonic that controls like he does in Generations in an open environment like we have in Shadow Gens or Frontiers, because this control scheme was very specifically tailored for linear levels with extreme forward momentum. And at the same time, you would not put Shadow's controls in a game like Generations because then they would make that game feel relatively sluggish and boring. This is also why I continue to be surprised by people I see online repeatedly asking for the drift to make a return. I can only see this as a fundamental lack of understanding of both the original Boost games and the more recent ones. The drift was always a necessity to take sharper turns at those ridiculously high speeds so that the levels could continue to be extremely fast without having to stay in a straight line. Now, not only can we not reach those speeds anymore, but we can already make those quick turns without a drift. It would be useless. Most of the comments that I found disparaging the old control scheme either imply or explicitly say that they struggle with the old controls after getting used to the new ones, and the only way that I can really interpret this is that people expect more precise control. But I do think that being able to control Sonic's direction as precisely as you can in Shadow Generations or Frontiers, while having to move as fast as you do in Unleashed or Generations, would make for a wildly awkward experience. Nothing that moves as fast as Sonic does in those games should be able to turn that quickly. The first few Boost games understood that and chose to put their priority on the speed and fast reaction times. The newer games have just chosen to flip that priority. So is the trade-off worth it? Well, in my opinion, no, not really. Like I said, I still prefer what we had before by a lot. I don't feel the same strong sense of blazing through levels as I did before, and that was a big part of why I loved those games. But now that I've seen this control scheme actually executed well for once, I understand that it mainly just comes down to personal preference. And the big reason that I don't really mind the controls in this game is because the level design is easily the best that we've seen from the series in a long time. Forces was heavily criticized for its overly linear and boring level design that would often end before it even got started, while Frontiers shamelessly copied level designs from previous installments only with a significantly worse control scheme that these levels were never built for in the first place. On the other hand, Shadow Generations has legitimately great level design. To start with, the levels are finally back to a length where it doesn't feel like they end just as soon as they're getting started, which was a huge problem with both Forces and Frontiers. All the stages here will take you a few minutes, and yes, I understand how ridiculous it is to be praising that, but I'm just glad that we're finally back to this point. But the thing that makes these levels so fun is the same thing that made the levels in the original generation so fun. The amount of split-second decisions you can make to take alternate pathways and chip off that much more of your clear time is just staggering, and I found myself actively wanting to replay these levels almost immediately to figure out all the potential skips and alternate sections that I had missed. There's a space in the very first level that really hit this home. It's pretty wide open with a lot of different ways to go that are immediately visible, and you can even discover later on that there's actually multiple different ways to enter this area. And this is all helped even further by the new Doom abilities. I was skeptical of these at first, not really sure how they would work with the normal Sonic gameplay loop, but I ended up being pretty happy with most of them. First isn't technically a Doom ability, but Chaos Control, and I have to say that this feels pretty cool to use normally. Stopping platforms in place always feels good, it lets you teleport in certain spots which is interesting and fun, and good use of this ability can lead you to some of the coolest hidden routes in the game. The Doom Spear is probably my least favorite, it just always feels clunky to use and I'd rather it not be here because it doesn't really add that much. I know that there's some more advanced movement tech that takes advantage of this ability, but that's just not how I like to play these games, and it's not the sort of thing that you discover naturally without seeing it online first. The Doom Blast, on the other hand, is probably my favorite to use. You can use it on certain enemies to send them flying onto a new path, and I felt like this had a lot of creative and satisfying applications. Doom Surf is simple enough, it just lets you traverse on water. It's pretty situational, but it does make for some fun set pieces. Doom Morph was, at first, by far my least favorite. I thought this thing controlled horribly and I dreaded using it every single time it came up. Now, with multiple playthroughs and some hindsight, I think that that's mainly because it's just so poorly tutorialized. The only pointer you get is that it functions like a grappling hook, which is pretty grossly misleading if you ask me. That is one function of it, but only if you let the whole swing play out, and that doesn't tell you anything about how letting go of it before that will send you rocketing through the grapple point. It also doesn't explain that its boost isn't meant to be held like Shadow's, but is instead a singular burst of speed. There's a lot to this thing movement-wise, and because of that, it's actually probably my favorite one in the game now, despite how much I hated it initially. It's not totally ideal because this still can be pretty unruly at points. I mean, just look at this. But even when you're just using this thing normally, you can go crazy with the movement in a way that I don't feel that you really can with Shadow's own base movement. Lastly is the Doom Wings, which I have kind of conflicting thoughts on. On one hand, the design is quite cool and it can be incredibly fun to use, specifically in the earlier levels of the game, but this thing also really does let you skip over the vast majority of some stages, and it can feel almost too broken. These are a big part of Radical Highway, which is probably my favorite stage in the game, but it also means that on a first playthrough, most players are all but guaranteed to miss massive portions of the level, which is really unfortunate. As a whole though, these abilities do go a long way to adding depth and replayability to levels, and on top of that, they're just fun to use. I don't know if I necessarily want to see them return, especially given how this game ended and how much Sonic Team has been known to drag out their other gimmicks like the Wisps, but regardless of where the series goes in the future, I think the Doom powers suit this particular game very well. To talk more specifics about the levels themselves, I'd say that every single one of them is good, but I feel there's also some clear room for improvement. Firstly is that in a bunch of the levels, Black Doom will send you hurtling through a hallucinatory version of Radical Highway, and these are at first really fun and exciting, but on repeat playthroughs, they're more just tiring than anything else, because they're a lot more linear and scripted than the main parts of the level, especially the parts where you're just sliding or going through a half-pipe at a fixed speed. Every time I replayed these, I found myself just wishing that they'd be over so that I could get back to the real level already. Also, instead of mixing 2D sections into 3D levels, the approach this game takes is splitting each stage into 2 acts, with Act 1 being fully 3D and Act 2 being fully 2D. I was honestly really disappointed by this at first, but I don't mind so much anymore, because the levels are still pretty good. I'd be lying if I said I found these as enjoyable as the Act 1 stages though, and this feels more like a cost-cutting measure than anything else. And I think that the developers are aware that the player base doesn't really care for 2D sections in the modern Sonic games, because Radical Highway as the final stage of the game is the only level where both acts are fully 3D. Which is a really obnoxious inconsistency, and it just makes me wish that every other stage in the game were like this. Like I said, these 2D levels aren't bad or anything, far from it. I actually ended up liking all of them. I just ended up preferring the 3D levels every single time. There's moments here where they make good use of the 2D plane, like the Death Egg robots in the background of Sunset Heights Act 2 destroying the platforms in the foreground, but it's nothing too crazy. There's definitely nothing on the same level as something like classic Sky Sanctuary from the original generations, but they're still good enough for me to enjoy. My biggest problem with the levels overall is that they're just once again way too easy to S-rank, which harms replayability significantly for me. In fairness, this has been a problem with the series since the original generations, but I still have to let out a sigh of disappointment whenever I boot up one of these games and am able to supposedly master all of the levels on my first try, despite very obvious room for improvement. I loved that the ranking systems used to be tough because they gave me such a huge incentive to go back and learn every inch of the levels to run them optimally, but I haven't had the incentive to do that in a really long time, and I miss it. I can also just acknowledge that these games are a lot easier now than they used to be, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does feel like the skill ceiling has been lowered significantly. Unfortunately, another one of my biggest gripes from Generations has also returned, that being that the game stops you in your tracks every few levels to force you to complete challenge acts. I actually found this pacing check to be even more obnoxious than the original Generations, because instead of having 9 mandatory challenges across the entire game, you're forced to complete 20 challenges in Shadow Generations before you roll credits. Although, credit where credit is due, when it comes to actually playing the challenges, I like these more than the ones in Generations. They're pretty fun mini-stage remixes, I just wish that they weren't mandatory, and it does hold back from the playthrough experience in my opinion. These challenge acts are once again used to unlock boss keys, and once you get to the actual boss fights, they're usually pretty good. It's nothing at the level of the supersonic fights from Frontiers in terms of spectacle, but these are still really exciting moments that are a lot more polished and fun to play than those fights. This is yet another side of the series that I'm so glad they're leaning into now. Every boss fight here is a big event with multiple phases, and I love it. The final boss against Sneagle Black Doom is especially fantastic, but I enjoyed all of these. And that just leaves the hub world to talk about, and this was an area that I was really curious about. I've made my distaste for Frontiers pretty clear throughout the video, but a large portion of that is because the open zone areas in that game are the main gameplay style, while the levels were shoved to the background only playing a supporting role. Everyone called that game a step in the right direction, but I could never do the same when the biggest reason that I played these games in the first place was shoved so far away from the spotlight. Here in Shadow Generations, though, the roles are reversed. The levels are the main focus of the game, with the open area being reserved for a more supportive role that connects the main beats of the game. The balance in this game is something that I can agree with way more than what Frontiers had, and it helps that the hub is actually pretty well designed too. White space in this game is pretty dense, and collectibles and mini challenges are scattered all over the place if you have a careful eye. Not one bit of space here is empty or meaningless, and because of that I actually found myself legitimately enjoying the time that I spent exploring this world, something that I never would have said about Frontiers. If these games are going to continue to have these open zone elements, this is how it should be done if you ask me, and I hope that this game's positive reception shows Sonic Team that levels can still work in the forefront. I feel like I've covered my thoughts on this game pretty thoroughly at this point, which leaves me in a position where I just have to say the quiet part out loud. I cannot in good conscience call this one of the best Sonic games like so many others have. Trust me, I like this game, I like going back to it, and I can see myself continuing to go back to it in the future. But just because it's been a long time since I could say any of those things, doesn't mean that I can forget about all the times that I said it in the past. I like this game a bit more than I do Sonic Colors, to put that in perspective, and since I don't have a backlog of videos detailing my opinions on the whole series, that puts it around here for me. Don't get me wrong, this is a win for the series, but we still have so much room to grow from here, and the only way that we're going to grow is by critically examining what we have. Look, I get it, this is the best 3D Sonic game in over a decade, it's exciting, but that doesn't mean that we should be glossing over issues or tearing down the older games to make this one look better in comparison, like I've seen so often from people online recently. I like Shadow Generations, but I would love to continue to get games that I like even more, whatever that looks like. It's tough to be completely optimistic about a series that has had such wild fluctuations in quality over the years, but at least for now, I'm hopeful that we're out of this rut that it feels like we've been stuck in for so long. I don't want to end this video sounding pessimistic. Shadow Generations is a solid game, and even if I'm not entirely on board with the hype, it just feels nice to have a Sonic game that I genuinely like again. Whether they stick with the boost formula for even longer or decide to veer off into something totally different again, I'm happy to say that for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to what this team has coming next.